Welcome to our regular podcast, Harlem Stories. I'm Robert Lazo,
Adam Feinberg.
and today's episode, we're going to be talking about co-ops.
Now, we've already started talking about condos, which are a smaller portion of the population of residences in Manhattan. But co-ops are a whole special breed. They're not available in many other parts of the country, and those that are, they're very small in quantity. So the reality is that it's something that makes Manhattan a very, very different market in terms of the housing population.
Okay, so I'm going to ask just a basic question. What is a co-op?
So a co-op is basically a residence, but it's set up from a legal standpoint as you're purchasing shares in a corporation. You are not buying real property like the way you would in a condo. But you put a condo building and a co-op building that were built at the exact same time, and they might have progressed differently over time, but one of them could have been formed legally as a condo and the other one could have been formed as a co-op. And that brings out a whole bunch of different ramifications, and how these types of purchases can be very different is the purpose of today's conversation. In buying a co-op, you're buying an apartment, but the apartment that you're purchasing, you're not actually purchasing the apartment. You're getting a lease on the apartment that you're interested in, and you're buying shares as part of that corporation. So that is one big distinction between condos and co-ops, and that's just the very beginning of the process and how these two differ. Now, trying to get a mortgage in a condo versus a co-op, condo is going to have all sorts of different variations in terms of how it might qualify for a mortgage, but in a larger sense, it's very similar to purchasing a condo in the rest of the nation. There are a little bit of process differences in condos in New York City versus buying anywhere else, but they're small in the grand scheme of things, such as you might have to do a purchaser board package. But in the grand scheme of things, the board still has to approve a buyer. So, for the most part, it's really about the building understanding its risk. Whereas in a co-op, not only are you, basically as a buyer, once you have an accepted offer and a contract signed, but after that point, then you are filling out a purchaser board package. Oftentimes, it's much longer, much more intricate than you would find in a condo board. But the real big difference is not only the level of detail that you're providing to the board, but on top of it, the board has the ability to say no to a particular buyer, and they don't have to indicate why they're saying no. So that's a really big difference between condos and co-ops.
So in both cases, you have to submit an application if it's either a co-op or a condo.
In the vast majority of cases, correct.
But in this particular case with a co-op, there has to be a decision made by the board?
Correct. So there's a co-op board. They're unpaid volunteers, and they're basically the ones to review your personal and financial circumstances. And I think what's in that co-op board package, I think, is probably the conversation for another episode, because that's a whole lengthy thing. But you are providing, all of your financials, taxes, references, things like that, in a board package, and ultimately, once you've actually gone through that and the board basically either has few or no questions, then from there, the co-op board will then ask to interview you in most cases. And in a handful of cases, they might even ask to see your present home and walk through it and make sure that you're going to basically be a good neighbor. In most cases, once you've actually passed the financial qualifications, the co-op boards are really just making sure that you're not going to be a headache, to the board and cause them all sorts of problems. So that's usually what they're looking for in terms of that board interview. So mostly the passing that board qualification is really, from the financial standpoint, is the most important. Now, buying in a co-op, since we are talking about those finance, components over here, some of the most important aspects over here is number one, they're looking at your debt to income ratio. So, in terms of that, they're looking at any debts that you might have that are recurring. Does not include things like, credit card bills that you're going to wind up paying off in 30 or 60 days. So short-term debts, or let's say even if you had like a maturing loan or something like that matures in the next, couple months, that would not be included. But anything that's like revolving debt that that you're not gonna pay the balance off, that will be included. So the typical co-op board, and it's going to vary from building to building, but in Manhattan, you can say, a safe estimate for the vast majority of buildings is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood about 28% debt to income ratio. And that's going to include any mortgage that you might have. It'll include those installment loans that you might have, and long-term credit card debt as well. So that debt to income ratio will take into all sorts of things. In terms of your income, well, that's something that we go over as agents, and that's where we can kind of help add value into the equation as to what's included and what might not be included. So that's part number one in how a co-op board is looking at your finances, the debt to income ratio. Number two, they're going to be looking at your post-closing liquidity. So what is post-closing liquidity? Well, if you're taking out a mortgage, they're going to look at that mortgage payment plus the maintenance, and we didn't really discuss too much on the maintenance at this point, but that is your basically the cost to maintain the building plus the property taxes are included in that number. And if there is a building mortgage, that will be included. Your share of that will be included in that number as well. So again, going back just a moment, that post-closing liquidity, what they're looking for is going to include your mortgage payment, if any, that maintenance payment. And then they're going to basically take those two numbers and say, you know what, we want 2 years worth of that in reserve after you figure out what your closing costs are going to be and remove that from your cash equation, and your down payment as well. So whatever you have in cash is what they're going to want to see 2 years worth. So let's say your mortgage is $1,000 a month and your maintenance is also $1,000 a month. That's $2,000 a month times 24 months. For 2 years. So that's $48,000 that the co-op board would want to see in your bank account after you account for the down payment and the closing costs. So if you had $200,000 and then you took out a large chunk of that for the down payment, and closing costs in a co-op tend to be pretty low, but if whatever remains of that money, you're going to have to make sure that still $48,000 is still in your bank account at a minimum.
For post-closing liquidity, a board would be typically looking for 24 months times your mortgage and maintenance.
So yeah, it's going to be 24 months of your mortgage and your maintenance. Now, a lot of buyers in New York are all cash buyers, so that makes that number a little easier to achieve in those situations. But yes, it would be your mortgage plus your monthly maintenance times 24 months. Now, not every building is going to be the same. Some might be much more liberal, and they might say, we only want to see 1.5 years worth of mortgage and maintenance for that post-closing liquidity. Others might want to see more than that 2 years. But, the vast majority of buildings are setting the tone at 2 years.
So, and also co-ops buildings don't document what the requirements are. This is just something that we as agents understand in terms of what the basic sort of requirements would be, but there's none of this is kind of written down anywhere in specific.
Yeah, that's correct. And although I'd have to say in places like Westchester, the laws had recently changed, and they are now required to state any reason why they might reject a buyer, and they will state what the requirements are. But in New York City, no such law exists on the books. So, at least for now, the laws might change. But for now, yeah, they could potentially reject. They don't tell us what these numbers are. They might kind of give us some hints and indications, but they don't usually tell us outright what those numbers are. Usually, the statement that you'll get is that every buyer is a different situation, and we review the totality of the buyer's situation.
So far, we've talked about two key factors with co-ops. First is the debt-to-income ratio, and then the second is the post-closing liquidity.
Now, there is one other requirement that's typical in co-ops as well, and that's the minimum down payment. And in most co-ops, although there's plenty that are going to be much higher, there's a few that are going to be lower, but in most co-ops, they are going to require 20% down. So, you'll hear throughout the country, a lot of bankers will say, 20% down as a requirement is a myth. Well, in Manhattan, the market does operate very differently. And usually, for most situations, that is not at all a myth. And in fact, it's required for the vast majority of co-ops. Now, there are probably only a handful of buildings that will permit like 15% or less down, and that's usually going to be more the northern Manhattan market. But even still, that the 20% standard is pretty standard. The exceptions, if you start looking at certain neighborhoods like Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue on the Upper East Side, there are some specific neighborhoods where it's pretty common to see 30%, 35%, 50% down payments, or some do not want a mortgage at all. And quite honestly, in those situations, you'll usually see the price much cheaper. But at the same time, like we said, you could be rejected for any reason. And I've heard of these buildings. Some of them will say, what, if the buyer doesn't own a yacht, they don't belong in this building. So it is like a private club that you're purchasing in, and the requirements are going to be different for each building.
Is there a way that a buyer could find out which co-op buildings would appeal to them more than others?
I think that's where the agents provide value, primarily because we're looking at these buildings all day, every day, often 7 days a week. The typical agent does work, 6 or 7 days a week. So, the reality is that's where we really come into the equation. So in terms of other things that make co-ops different, so we've already talked about how you're purchasing shares in a corporation. Most are going to have a board package. They'll have a board interview. They can reject buyers for any reason, or hopefully they should have any real reason. We talked about their down payments and financial requirements. We talked a little bit about the monthlies. Now, things that we haven't talked about is, who might be an ideal co-op buyer. And I can tell you without, obviously getting into things like fair housing laws and discriminatory, there are certain, categories that aren't exactly, the most friendly to the vast majority of co-ops. And that's going to be, for instance, your investor population. So the vast majority of co-ops are looking for primary residents. Not to say that most co-ops won't allow subletting, but some won't. And those that do, typically you're going to find them is they'll only permit subletting the apartment 2 or 3 years in a row. And after that, they're looking for you to reside in the apartment again. So, there are requirements in terms of every building and what they have. And this kind of goes back to your question of how do you find what buildings are right for you? That's going to be among those topics. And in a related topic, but separate category, is the pied-à-terre buyer. The board policies are gonna vary from building to building, and typically you're gonna see most co-ops really want to see primary residents. They don't really want to see an empty building most of the time, especially for over the winter and people go down south. Most buildings are primarily focusing on primary residents. So the some of the other categories over here, also those that are non-citizens of the U.S., that is not a protected class in terms of fair housing. So a lot of times, also, if there's any kind of default, there's the concern of, will they easily be able to collect if they're not citizens, if they go back to their country. Collection laws are, very different. So that is also a determinant in terms of that. Now, we talked about these categories of who might qualify, who might not qualify. So just know these are also some of the big differences. I think the final category that we really need to talk about and what distinguishes differences in co-ops and from condos is the topic of the pricing. And since we've talked about all these different quantifiers and qualifiers on co-ops that you don't have in condos, what do you think that might do to pricing? I think the obvious answer is, it's going to mean that these obstacles that you're putting in their way, are going to be definitely going to send the price down versus the same or identical apartment that if it were in a condo building. So the fact that not everyone can qualify, there's going to be other restrictions in some co-op buildings. Some co-op buildings will not permit dogs or certain breeds of dogs. Now, that's possible in condos too, but that's less likely in condos. Co-ops are known for being very selective. They want people that are very much like themselves, in terms of their behaviors, in terms of their living style. And, so these are some really important points that really distinguish condos versus co-ops and what's different about the co-op world. Really, in terms of inventory and demand, the vast majority of the inventory in Manhattan is going to be co-ops. What would you estimate? The percentage, around 70%? Does that sound right to you?
That's about right.
Yeah, so around 70% of the current inventory is co-ops. So number one, they are much more plentiful in number than condos. So that also sends up the supply versus demand equation in condos. Versus co-ops, but also in terms of just the availability of of housing options. If roughly 2/3 of the inventory is going to be co-ops, obviously that's going to really kind of help define some of what your choices might be.
So in other words, what you're saying is that because the requirements are stricter than a condo, and because there are in general more co-ops that are available, the prices of co-ops tend to be lower compared to condos.
Yeah, not only are they tend to be lower, they tend to be significantly lower. And you can find a pricing differential between those two very often somewhere in the range. And it's going to depend on building by building, but we tend to see them range between 15 to 30% discount versus a condo.
So obviously, if you're planning on living in your apartment rather than running it out, you're definitely going to be better off looking at a co-op rather than a condo.
In most cases, yeah. I mean, because the condo style tends to encourage a lot more investors, a lot more pied-à-terre buyers. Yeah, in the vast majority of co-ops, you are going to be, feel a little bit more comfortable in a co-op for very much that reason. Now, that's not to say that there aren't co-ops that, that permit free subletting or free investors, but they are a very small percentage of the total co-op population. And, very often we have investors that wind up approaching us, because co-ops tend to be cheaper. They're automatically attracted to co-ops. And there are some investor-friendly co-ops out there, not a whole lot of them. And while they do tend to be cheaper than condos at the same token, they're not necessarily a huge amount cheaper because obviously there's less obstacles to purchasing those units.
Okay, very good. We'll be right back. We're back, and we are talking about co-ops.
So I think to kind of wrap up and just really make the distinction between condos and co-ops at this point, even though this episode was focusing on co-ops, I think we are now wrapping with the most basic aspects. So let's just do a quick rundown of condos versus co-ops now that I've broken it down into detail. I think it makes more sense over here. So if we're to do a quick summary over here, in a condo, you're purchasing real property. In a co-op, you're buying shares in a corporation. In a condo, many of them will have a board package and application they can't reject. In a co-op, they almost all will have a board package and application, and they can reject. There's also a board interview in a co-op where there is not in a condo. In terms of down payments and the financial component, in condos, if you can get a bank to finance with just 10% down, that's okay with the condo for the vast majority of those buildings. Whereas in a co-op, you're going to have a minimum 20% down payment in most buildings, though there's plenty of buildings that require much more and very few that do not. In terms of any other additional financial requirements, as long as a bank will finance you with that 10%, nothing else really matters in terms of the financials. In terms of co-op, though, you're going to have that 28% maximum debt to income ratio and 2 years worth of post-closing liquidity. So that gives you quite a bit on difference on that. In a condo, in terms of those monthly charges, want to make sure we're clear on this. There are two different monthly charges in a condo. There is the monthly common charges, which is really maintaining the building and potentially a reserve. And then there's your taxes. So they're two separate categories, but if you add them up, that's your total monthlies. And in a co-op, you have one number typically, and that's going to be the monthly maintenance, and that monthly maintenance will include your property taxes. Now, to be clear, in New York City, whether it's a condo or a co-op, the vast majority of buildings also include your heat and hot water as standard, primarily because we're vertical living and we're all sharing, the same kind of plumbing, so it's much harder to start subdividing. So, typically one boiler for the entire building or two, depending on, or however the building is set up. But, one boiler might be able to handle many, many different apartments. So in terms of some of the other structures and who else can purchase over here, in a condo, you can typically freely sublet the apartment. You can typically use it as a pied-à-terre. And as a result of some of these policies over here, there's going to be, and I'm sorry, I forgot one category. Also, non-U.S. citizens are also, a good category of buyers for condos. And as a result, we often expect in condos the level of owner occupancy tends to be lower, primarily because these buildings do freely permit this kind of openness in terms of, who can reside in the building. As opposed to co-ops, where there's limitations in terms of the vast majority of the term limits, 2 to 3 years out of every 5 is the most common ruling over here. Whether you can use the apartment as a pied-à-terre, as another component, and also whether you're a U.S. citizen or not is the final consideration in terms of who is going to typically wind up living in there. Finally, the last difference that I wanted to kind of summarize between condos and co-ops is going to be the pricing. And in terms of condos, They tend to be more expensive because they're fewer in number and there's a lot more flexibility. And in terms of co-ops, there's a lot less flexibility and they are greatly much significant in quantity and availability. So there could be a difference as much as 15 to 30% in terms of pricing between the typical condo versus co-op. And I think that's a pretty good summary of what we should expect when we're considering condos versus co-ops. Now, I know this is Harlem Stories, and we'll be discussing plenty of different episodes where we get into much more specifics. But we felt it was important to kind of lay some groundwork, before getting into a lot of the neighborhood-specific types of situations.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Adam, and thank you for joining us. And we will be back next time with Harlem Stories.